Well, hello. The purpose of this tutorial is to establish a scalable solution for developing in an AWS environment while using C#. And the focus of this video is to implement Jenkins on an EC2 server to promote better access for a team of developers contributing the same source code. The EC2 server gives us the ability to target Jenkins over a public IP. So the objectives are to integrate Jenkins with GitHub, and to build an EC2 instance with Jenkins, configure Jenkins so that it could be used with GitHub webhooks. Let's get started. So the prerequisites for this are having an AWS developer account, a GitHub account, Visual Studio, AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio, and Git Bash. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my AWS account. So from the developer console, once you log in, just go to EC2. And then we're going to go ahead and launch an instance. We're going to pick the 64-bit Linux and the T2 free tier. Now we are going to need an IAM role, and I already have some here, but just to show you which IAM role it is, if we go create new IAM role, we can create role. We're going to select AWS service, EC2, set the permissions, and this role is going to be Amazon EC2 role for FSM. Give it a name. Alright, so once you've created that role, back in this page for creating our EC2 instance, we can drop it down. If I hit refresh, I'll actually see that role I just made. So I'll just go ahead and use that one. Leave the default storage. And let's go ahead and give it a tag. So this EC2 instance is going to be hosting a Docker container that has Jenkins installed on it. Okay, so this part's important. We're going to add a TCP, custom TCP rule, and this is what's going to allow GitHub to access our server through port 8080, which is what Jenkins is being connected to the outside world on. So launch. Now it's going to ask you for an existing pair. I'm just going to go ahead and proceed without a key pair. However, if you, because I'm not going to have this long term, but if you were going to have this long term, I'd suggest getting a key pair. This allows you to access your server remotely from PowerShell or anything else on your desktop. Alright, so now that's created. And right here it's starting up. This is what I had earlier, so don't worry about that. And then this is the IP address it gave us. So this is what now gives us the ability to connect to Jenkins. The alternative to this is install it on your local desktop. But if you did that and you had a team of people contributing to it, it can get way more complicated to connect. And plus it's not a reliable solution. Having a server hosting your Jenkins is really what you want with DevOps. Alright, so now it's running. Now we need to get into that server, and to do that we go to System Manager. I'm going to open this in a new tab. And we're going to go to Session Manager. We're going to start this session, and there's our new server we just spun up. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is sudo up, and then go ahead and install Docker. Alright, so now we need to start Docker. And if we want to do a check, now this tells us it started, but there's no containers running. So we could just go to Docker Hub and pull a pre-made image. This one is the one you want. The problem with this is I've already done it, and I can tell you that to build a C# or a .NET Core 3.1 build inside this container is not going to work. It's going to give us errors, and that requires dependency. But that's the beautiful thing about Docker is we can use this image as our base image, and we can add to it any dependencies we need with a Docker file. And so if you go to my GitHub, which will be linked in the description, you can actually see I already have a Docker file for this. So we're just going to go ahead and copy this. So I'm just going to make a folder to put this Docker file in. Use your editor of choice. Alright, paste this in here, and what this is doing is this is actually going to pull that image I just showed you from Docker Hub, change the user privileges to root so that we could do an update, and then install this dependency, libicu, which is needed for C# builds. And then it switches back to the Jenkins user. Alright, now we need to build that. So here it is, pulling it from Docker Hub. And now here it is installing the libicu dependencies. Alright, now we actually want to start this. And staying in the same folder directory that we're at, let's just go ahead and docker run. And we want to define the port that we're going to be able to connect to this. So this connects the port of our Docker container to our server 8080. And that's how the outside world will get to it. And we need 50,000. Now this tag, this -v, is going to allow us to define a directory in our container, not in our host container, or in our host machine, but on our Docker container, that we will store all Jenkins data. So any changes you make, anything you add, we need some way of it to persist. When you do a reboot to restart, if this server goes down and comes back up, you will lose all that, so that's important. And then Docker file. This is Docker file because that's what I named it, the custom Docker file I built. Okay, so that's calling that. And now it started the container. So now right there we can see. Here's the container ID. Now I actually need to look at the logs. And the reason is when you start it, it wants you to initialize with this default admin password, and it's the only way you can get it. So just look at the logs. Now let's go ahead and go into it. So to go into it, remember it's going to be our IP address for the instance, the EC2 instance that we just spun up with port 8080. And now it's prompted us for that admin password. Now we're going to install some of these generic plugins. Alright, now that takes a minute to finish. Once it's done, go ahead and give ourselves a username. Alright, so now this is, like I said before, this is why we're doing it this way. We set it up on EC2 instance that gives us a public IP on a server that's reliable, and the port 8080 gives us the Jenkins, and then this is what we can use to establish our webhooks. Alright, so now the first thing we're going to do is go into management, manage credentials, and we're going to set up the credentials that allow us to log into GitHub. And these are global credentials, so any job you create in Jenkins it can have access to. You can actually do more local credentials if you need to, or team member credentials. Leave ID blank, it'll give you that. Now this is sign-in credentials, as if you were signing into GitHub. We're going to also want to create a different credential. This time we're going to need to go to our GitHub and get an authentication token from developer settings, personal access tokens, generate a new token, and we're going to give it repo permissions. It could be this, I'm pretty sure just status is good enough. So now be careful, make sure to copy this when you see it. This will go away. And of course, I will be deleting all these tokens after this. Alright, so this is going to be a secret text, or this is the secret. Leave ID. Alright, now we have both credentials we need. Go back to dashboard, manage Jenkins, and now let's install the additional plugins. So the first one we're going to need is to be able to build a C#. We need a .NET SDK. So right here. Now install that. And then we're going to need GitHub pull request build right here. Oops, sorry, go back into here, and there's one more. Oh yeah, it's post build. We're gonna set post build. after we get a successful build, we can actually run a report, return it back to GitHub. Alright, now that's done. It keeps recommending restart. I've done this without restarting, but if it makes you feel better, you could just type restart at the end of this Jenkins IP address. It'll prompt you to restart, and then you can wait, and it'll automatically jump back into the splash screen. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to configure, go to global tool configuration. We're going to configure our .NET. So now this is important to match it up with what your project is. So the project name of that I'm working with is Alexa Verification Tools. It's something that I will establish for people who want to set up their Alexa development environment for developing Alexa skills in AWS with Lambda functions. So, and if I go to my actual project and right click, you'll see that I'm using .NET Core 3.1. If you're using any of these, I think it would work, but AWS actually only for now has 3.1 and 2.2. So you kind of have to use those. So we're going to select .NET Core 3.1, most early release, or the latest release rather. And because our EC2 instance is a Linux, we're going to want this platform. And what this is doing, this plugin, is it downloads directly from the Microsoft website, untars it, and then applies the MS Build DLL to your source code to build it. And then I believe afterwards deletes it every time. So, or no, actually it downloads it once, and this is the importance of in our Docker file having this line here. Sorry. When we run it with the home folder location, and that way it only has to download this once. It saves time. Now the other thing we're going to do is configure the GitHub pull request builder. Now what this is doing is pretty much giving a trigger to GitHub. Providing a trigger for GitHub to be able to trigger this build remotely. That way we don't have to keep logging into Jenkins every time we do a pull request. So if you scroll all the way down to GitHub pull request builder, we can use the sign-in, but the problem I've had with the sign-in is when I test the connection, or even when I try to set this up, it doesn't work. It gives this authentication error. So I think that's GitHub maybe did a recent change. Now it requires a token. So if we switch that token we generated from GitHub and connect, we'd see connected. So this is kind of a nice little feature just to test before you get everything set up. Make sure you can communicate back and forth from Jenkins to GitHub. Leave this default. The only time you can change this is if you're using Enterprise Edition and have a server. We're going to leave auto manage webhooks. Now this is important. This is my GitHub username and my Jenkins username, so I don't know which one this is persistent or connected with. I think it's GitHub. Yeah, I'm almost positive this is whatever your username is on GitHub, but keep it easy, just make them the same. If you have a team though, add your team GitHub names here in this admin list. And there's a lot more here. We don't need any of that for now. So now let's actually create our job. Now just for the speed, we're going to just go ahead and do a freestyle project. However, if you want to get more complicated, you can have a Jenkins file, and in your Jenkins file you do a lot more actions in a multi-branch pipeline. For example, you can have a deployment method afterwards, you can send logs, you can even route reports to emails, different DevOps tools. So once we go in here, we're going to select GitHub project, copy the project URL, source code management, Git. And this time we're going to use our login name, credentials, branch specifier. So now if you look, I have two branches. This is a development branch. You can have a PR branch, master branch. You could do rules for just one branch, for all branches. This is where you do that. I'm just going to go ahead and add another branch for my development. Now we're going to use, this is available right here because we installed that plugin, GitHub Pull Request Builder, and it automatically puts me on the admin list because I did it in the configuration. We're going to use GitHub hooks for build triggering, but one more thing is, actually I'll leave it off, but for now so you can see the error, but it needs my account name here too as well. Everything else is by default. Let's go back into configure, and we need to add our build. So we're going to do the .NET build project, and as you can see, it should be showing what we just set up. So let's double check that. Oh yeah, it did not get a name. So this will be our .NET Core 3.1. Name doesn't matter, just a name. So now, if we go back into our job, configure, now we see the name, everything else. Oh, actually, to build it, we need to tell it where our solution is. So here's our solution folder, and it's at the top level. So now this is telling it where to find the solution. And let's just do a test build from here. So if I click build now, it's going to target my GitHub repo. So now I can see what's going on here. So it gave us a fail. Let's see what's happening. It looks like it's trying to grab that. Yeah, let's double check. Oh, this is not supposed to be here. We actually don't need anything in this label. that was not set up right. So let's go ahead and do another build. Go in here, we can see what's happening. Alright, so there you go. And now installed the tarball here. Alright, there we go. Build succeeded. You see green check mark. So that we know it builds, let's go see if we can trigger it from GitHub. And here's your job list that's going to be over there. Now to set your GitHub up, we actually got to go into settings. And I want to set a rule for the branch. I don't want to be able to do pull requests unless it passed all of the tests. And in just a moment I'll show you the unit testing we're going to check. So this rule is going to be for required status test to pass. Give it a name. Now you can see, because we've already ran a couple builds, I'm pretty sure that's what allowed us to pop up. If you don't see anything, we'll set up our webhook. Once that happens, it should be able to auto detect the Jenkins. That actually might just be there by default. I'm not sure. I never checked it. So now our GitHub hook, the URL. See, this is why you don't want to do this locally. Otherwise, you'd be using a local host. Now we have an IP address. Okay, so now after this, you could do GitHub webhook. Now this is important, it has to be specific, and where you get that from is actually in Jenkins. So if you go to global security, and if I do delegate to servlet, you can see that these are the URL prefixes that it uses. GitHub webhook would be used. However, because we're using the GitHub pull request builder, we're going to want to use this one. Now, I don't want to change my global security settings right here. You can get locked out. If you do that, then you have to edit a config XML in your Jenkins directory, and that can be kind of painful. Alright, so this is the payload URL that we're going to use, application JSON. Just leave sacred blank. You could define this though. And we want to select pull request for this webhook and pushes, and I can show you in a minute why we would use that, but for now let's just focus on pull request. Alright, so now that's set up. Let's go ahead and make a change to our source code. I'll just make a second test that does the exact same thing. Save it. Alright, let's go ahead and pull that. Alright, so here's the additional test. Now when I create this, it should trigger, and we should see the build. And it should also not allow us to merge. Alright, so here's the request. It's coming through. That means our webhook's working. Now, if you want to, you could go to the webhook and actually see the payload information right here. So green check marks means that the last pull request sent to payload. and got a good response from our Jenkins URL. And you can actually see what's in the payload and everything else. Let's see what's happening. Alright, looks good. Alright, so another thing is, I don't think I had my name in this whitelist. I thought it was required, but it looks like I was able to do it. But just as a caveat, if you ever have problems with your webhook payload or your webhook URLs in GitHub or receiving, or it doesn't seem like things are communicating, you can just go to the system logs here and you can actually see right here it's checking the pull request. And so one thing I mentioned is we can configure this to do a unit test. So if I add build step using that .NET SDK, we can run unit test, and we're going to use the MS build that we already set up. Now, before I ran this, and I was not able to get the unit test when I put this directory in here. I could see if it works again, but ultimately I just had to remove it and let it search for the unit test file. So that's Jenkins for you. Alright, let's do another pull request and intentionally break it, the second one we made. So all this test function is doing is making sure that this hello world gets changed to upper in our lambda function. So test that, certs it's true. So this will obviously not work because I just inserted 2 lowercase letters. So we're going to save that. Oops. Looks like I'm getting some upstream error. I'll just fix that later. Alright, so now we're going to do a pull request on a known broken test, and let's see if it runs that. Before we do that, I could just run it. If I hit build now, it will call those unit tests. So I guess this will just give us a good overall test of the test. So now create the pull request. I don't like GitHub. It quickly shows you that you can merge, and if you're quick and you can click that button, you can actually merge it before it runs the test. So just be mindful of that. So here's our test. So it looks like everything's running, but we know it's not. And the reason is, if you look, we should see the actual test being performed. And also, I'm not sure why I did these 2 builds back to back. So let's just go ahead and delete this, and we're going to let it just search for the test file. So again, if we just do build, it's going to do the same thing. So now, right now, it should be running the test with .NET Test. Before it wasn't. So that's the check. If you want to make sure you got your pipeline set up right, just don't assume because it gives you a green check mark that it's working. Actually go in your logs, and so now it found the test file, and there we go. So it's showing us that failed test, give us an error. So now if we do this pull request again, see, before it actually didn't run the test, so this could be deceiving. You think you have a good branch. So I'm going to close this and reopen it. so I can trigger that. And now let's see what happens from here. Alright, so now it's telling us that the check failed. Okay, and there you have it. That's how we can integrate GitHub with Jenkins to manage our tests and pull requests.